So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we start with a new text today, having finished Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So the new text today, which we'll start with, is The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. And as some of you know, this is part of the bigger collection of poems that Eliot published in 1917 called Prufrock and Other Observations, which should be on the screen at the moment. Now, before I dive into the text, I'll just give a very brief background or the context which produced this poem, in the sense that it's a very modernist poem, and it's important for us to know that Eliot is obviously coming to this poem from a certain tradition of writing, and that the chief tradition that he's appropriating over here is a French symbolist tradition. So the influence of Mallarmé, the influence of Baudelaire, the influence of all the French symbolist poets are very heavily present in Eliot's early poetry. And those of you interested in Eliot would know that his poetry can be broadly divided into two different kinds, almost like two different qualities, two different genres of poetry. So his early poetry is very symbolist, it's very urban, it's very cinematic. We'll talk about the cinematic quality, the visual cinematic quality in this particular poem as well. And it's full of velocity and brokenness and fragmentation, and very, very urban, very metropolitan. It contains the metropolitan madness and neurosis, and also the metropolitan mysticism, that you get a moment epiphany in certain very mundane conditions. How is an epiphany produced, generated, and experienced in a very mundane metropolitan condition? So Eliot's early poetry is full of those urban elements, urban pointers. Now, if you take a look at his later poetry, Poe's Wasteland, and we'll look at Wasteland as well in this particular course, we'll study that as a text. If you take a look at his later poems, let's say the Four Quartets, that kind of poetry is very, very spiritual. It's almost mystical. It's very far removed from this metropolitan velocity and madness and fragmentation. Rather, it's a poetry of reconciliation, of very, very passive spiritual surrender. And that has something to do with Eliot's personal orientation as a man as well, because some of you know, he was converted into Roman Catholicism. He became a Catholic in his later life. So his later poetry is very much part of the Catholic tradition of poetry, and very religious and very spiritual. But this particular poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, is one of the most famous poems Eliot ever wrote. One of those poems that he's most known for. It's full of this metropolitan pointers. It's very, very visual. It's very cinematic. It's very broken. It's very fragmented, and it's very neurotic as well. And this neurosis is a very big element in Eliot's early poetry, and for that matter, in much of modernist narratives. We saw, like for instance, we just finished Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and we saw how there's a very interesting relationship to be made there between neurosis and narrative, and how Marlowe's narrative is informed by his neurosis. And so it's part of the neurotic problem as well, that the fact that it can't really deliver a story and put that into a narrative, right? That becomes a problem for Marlowe. Now, a similar kind of problem happens in Eliot's early poetry as well, especially in this particular poem. The speaker, J. Alfred Prufrock, is a middle-aged, presumably bourgeois man who wants to frequent the very, very upper-class social circles, but he can't really get along with his story. He can't really tell you the story, and at some point he will tell you, it's impossible to say just what I mean. It becomes a line in this particular poem. And again, his inability or the impossibility to just say what you mean is very much part of the modernist tradition. And if you take a look at the broader scenario over here, what's happening is the poets and the writers are becoming increasingly aware of the inadequacy of language. In other words, the entire grammar of classic realism, the entire instrument, the entire machinery of classic realism is breaking up in modernism, and they're looking for a different kind of expression, a different sort of vectors of expression, which will be more befitting the emotional complexity. In other words, we don't really have the linguistic machinery to deliver the emotional entanglement, and that's part of the modernist problem. The problem in modernist literature, and what gets foregrounded over and over again, is this inability to convey the emotional entanglement in a particular linguistic machinery, right? So even here in J. Alfred Prufrock, the love song, you'll find it's not really a love song at all. It's an anti-love song. So in that sense, it's a deconstruction of the love song. The typical idyllic love song has been deconstructed over here. But the more important issue at hand is the inability to find the right language for your emotional expression. So the complexity of the emotional expression, the complexity of the human brain, and the inadequacy of the artificial machinery of language to convey the complexity, the complex sensations of the human brain. That becomes a big part of the modernist problem, and as a result of which we have so many techniques such as defamiliarization, which you saw in Conrad. We have stream of consciousness, which we see rampantly in Joyce's Ulysses, which we'll study in this course, and also Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. So that becomes a very big meta issue, so to say, in modernism, okay, and that's something which we have to bear in mind. So this is a poem about fragmentation, about the metropolitan alienation. Is an alienation of man in a massive metropolis. The human subject is being isolated and completely alienated in a massive metropolis, and that becomes a huge problem, and that obviously becomes very, very existential in quality. Very quickly it becomes existential in quality, right? And that, you know, all this becomes part of the crisis in this particular poem. So the crisis is one of social crisis. He wants to mingle in a particular social circle which doesn't respect him, which doesn't receive him warmly. It disparages him, it makes jibes at him, at his appearance. The problem is also linguistic. He doesn't find the right language to express himself, and the problem ultimately becomes very, very existential. So it's a social alienation, there's a linguistic alienation, there's an existential alienation, which is basically what this poem is all about, right? And also, this poem is about procrastination. It's about getting on to do something but not really finishing it. The entire poem is about let us go and get in the circle, let us go and make the visit, let us go and talk to someone, let us go and speak to someone, let us go and mingle in a certain circle, but that visit is never materialized, that visit is never finished, that visit is never done. So this half-done quality, this undone quality in Eliot's early poetry is something which is very important for us to understand. And again, that becomes a large part of the metropolitan problem. And it's about metropolitan madness, it's about velocity, it's about fragmentation, it's about alienation, and it's also about procrastination. It's about not getting things done. It's about not finishing things, right? And this not finishing things becomes a very big important issue in Eliot's early poetry, and that's something which we will look at very closely as well. There's an inertia quality about it as well. Okay, now before we begin this poem, there's a little epigram right at the beginning, which actually I looked up for the first time today before I came to teach you. I didn't actually know what this was from. I always saw it, but I didn't quite know what this was about. This is actually from Dante's Inferno, and this is about a speaker in Dante's Inferno who's telling you that, you know, I would speak, but no one would believe me. So, you know, that's the reason why I become this, you know, I come back from the dead, but no one would listen to what I'm saying, no one would believe what I'm saying, and as a result of which, that gives me a sense of freedom. Right, so this line in Italian, actually, this is from Dante's Inferno. This is what it translates into in English. The fact that the speaker is telling you that, you know, I can tell you different things. I can tell you the horror images, the horror experience that I've experienced in Inferno, but no one is going to believe me. No one will listen to me. Right, and that gives me a sense of freedom. That gives me a sense of emancipation. That gives me a sense of agency. Okay, so that's a very important quotation, an epigram with which this poem begins. And as you can see, Eliot is very, very clearly situating himself apropos of that Eurocentric tradition of writing, this European tradition of writing, and we see that more rampantly in Wasteland. It's full of allusions from Spenser's Fairy Queen, from Dante's Inferno, from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It's full of different kinds of references to different kinds of European traditions of writing, and Eliot is very much becoming a part of that European tradition. And again, it's important, it's worthwhile actually to bear in mind Eliot's personal proclivities over here. He's an American. He came to Britain from America. He's actually born in America, but he was very much trying, he's very hard, you know, he's trying very hard to appropriate the European British tradition of writing, and that shows quite clearly in his poetry as well. Okay, so let's dive into the poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. And this is how it begins. So just read out the first stanza and then we'll start talking about it in some details. Let us go then, you and I, when our evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go, through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent, to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Now, at the very beginning, you find that it starts with an invitation, a very dramatic invitation. Let us go, then you and I. It sounds romantic. Let us go, the evening is falling, spread out against the sky, and the first two lines will give an image of idyllic romanticism. It's almost like a romantic poem, beckoning someone to go out with you, inviting someone warmly in a romantic rhetoric to go out and take a walk as the evening is falling against the sky. But the very third line has a medical metaphor, which is important for us to observe. Like a patient etherized upon a table, and we understand, we think, what is this image doing here? I mean, an otherwise romantic beginning. So the evening, which is spread out against the sky, is basically like a patient etherized upon a table, and this image of the patient spread across the table, etherized, numbed in a table, about to be operated. It also brings in mind the medieval rack of torture, which had a very similar structure, by the way. The human subject was placed on that medieval rack, and it was spread across the rack in terms of torturing him, and the entire instrument of torture would be then operated on him. So in both cases, the patient etherized upon a table, as was a medieval rack of torture, we have the space of oppression. We have a space where the human subject's agency is completely annihilated. There's no agency at all, so to say. So the patient etherized upon a table, numbed in a table, and its entire image of numbness becomes important, because what that conveys is a lack of feeling, is a complete annihilation of feeling. And with that annihilation, with that depletion of feeling, obviously that is connected to a depletion of emotions, a depletion of agency. And we'll find that in more dramatic descriptions in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, where the human subject is completely bereft of emotions, right? And that loss of emotion becomes almost a cognitive crisis. And the cognitive crisis is very much there in Eliot's poetry as well. The fear, the crisis of cognition, the crisis of recognition and cognition is rampantly present in Eliot's early poetry. So that image of the patient etherized upon a table, numbed on a table, is very, very important for us to observe, and we'll come back to it, and we find how that connects to the other narratives that this poem is offering us. Okay, let us go to a certain half-deserted street. So again, look at the halfness of Eliot's early poetry. It's half-deserted, which is also say is half-full, but it doesn't pick half-full. He says half-deserted. So the sense of abandonment is very much there in Eliot's early poetry, and especially in Prufrock. That there's an image of something being abandoned. There's an image of a space being abandoned, a subject being abandoned, and that sense of being abandoned is very much there, and that's something which is a recurring motif, so to say, in Eliot's early poetry. This half-deserted streets is a very crucial metaphor for that. Okay, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotel. So again, this whole image of the cheap hotel, the very seedy space of the cheap hotel, is important for us to observe. And the hotel image is important because what we get is not a home image. It's not really an image of a home, of warmth, of stability, of solidity. It's not that at all. Instead, it's an image of liminality, of frequency, of recurring visits, coming and going, with no sense of inhabition, and this image of coming and going comes back in the end as well. But the fact that, look at the way in which that image of woman coming and going, talking of Michelangelo, is being prepared by the hotel image over here, the cheap hotels. So people just come in for one night, often for some very dubious reasons, for some very, very dodgy reasons, right? So that image of one-night cheap hotels, which is also a very, very negative reflection of human relationships, which is fragmented, alienated, just debased into some very, very basic, excuse me, into something not very luxurious, not very fertile, not very rich at all. And that sense of abandoned spaces, that sense of cheap spaces, that sense of being exhausted is very much there in this image of these one-night cheap hotels, restless nights in one-night cheap hotels. So again, there's no peace at all. It's a complete anti-image of peace, right? So it's anti-peace, anti-tranquility, anti-fulfillment. And so what we have is fragmentation, alienation, isolation, and that becomes restless, and that restlessness is generated out of that space, this one-night cheap hotels, which is obviously an image of very seedy, dodgy activity, right? Not rich or fulfilling human activity at all. And sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent. So again, the whole idea of tedious argument is not really a clever argument. It's not really a penetrating argument. It's a tedious argument. It knacks you. It exhausts you. It irritates you. It makes you nervous. It makes you irritated, right? Of insidious intent. So the intent is insidious. Intent is something which is not benevolent at all, right? So look at the way in which space and a human mind are connected to each other over here. So the street is, compared to or described as a tedious argument, right? Again, this is something which we find very, very heavily present in Eliot's early poetry, which is to say the example of metaphysical conceit, right? And if you look at, those of you who are aware of metaphysical poetry would know the poetry of John Donne, Andrew Marvell, they relied very heavily on this particular technique where two different very disparate objects, very disparate entities will be compared. Like for instance, John Donne in his poem, in his one particular poem about two lovers, he would say, the male lover would say to the female subject that no matter how far I go away from you, we're like two hands of a compass, so no matter how much stretch, we're connected at one basic foundational point. So again, using something, a mathematical instrument like compass, to talk about human emotions, to talk about human love, is something which is very shocking, and that metaphysical conceit had a shocking effect, had a shock effect, which is deliberately dramatized and conveyed to the reader. Now, we find something similar in Eliot's early poetry as well, in a sense that we have this metaphysical conceits, we have these very disparate entities sort of almost violently put together to defamiliarize the emotion. And that act of defamiliarization is important because we saw that in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and we see that now in more dramatic elements in Eliot's early poetry, in a space of poetry where defamiliarization actually has more of an effect on us. And even, poetry as a genre, so to say, is about defamiliarization, right? It does something special to language. It changes language, it changes the arrangement of language, it changes the entire grammar of language, and it makes language into something else, right? So the way you consume language in poetry becomes very, very different from the way we consume, let's say, in a novel or in a short story, okay? Generally speaking. So, and modernist poetry is all about defamiliarization. Modernist poetry is all about making something strange, right? And it's a very strange metaphor if you think about it. The street is being compared to an argument, a tedious argument, something which follows you all the time, a tedious argument which nags you, which doesn't let you go, which follows you, which sort of almost stalks you. And that's the street over here, like the argument, is stalking you. So it's like a stalker metaphor, which is used over here. But then that leads you to an overwhelming question. And what is the question? Oh, do not ask what is it. Let us go and make our visit. Right? So again, there's a degree of procrastination over here. Do not ask the question. Do not ask what is it. No, it's a half-complete question. Instead, let us go and make our visit. Right? In the room, the woman come and go, talking of Michelangelo. So again, the entire liminality, the movement of woman coming and going, speaking of Michelangelo, is something which is deliberately given to us. And now this particular scene, if you visualize it, is a very cinematic scene where woman coming and going, talking of Michelangelo, is obviously a very high culture space. It's a space of highbrow culture, very upper class social circles where, let's say, very wealthy, privileged people come and talk about art and culture and literature and painting and different kinds of artistic activities which only the very privileged have access to, right? So this reference to Michelangelo over here becomes a signifier of privilege, becomes a signifier of high culture, and culture as consumed by privileged people. So culture over here becomes an act of consumption, right? And in order to have access to that cultural space, to that space in particular, we need to have the pointers of privilege. You need to wear the right kind of dress, you need to speak the right kind of language, you need to have the right kind of embodiment, right? So embodiment becomes a very important issue in Eliot's early poetry, and it's something I wanted to come to very early on. Now, what is embodiment? Embodiment is the process through which you neurally as well as discursively negotiate with your surroundings. That's the working definition of embodiment for the purpose of this particular course. So how do you neurally and cognitively negotiate with your environment, right? And also that cognitive neural negotiation also becomes discursive in quality. Let's say, for instance, if you use language as an example. The use of language at a very embedded level is neural and cognitive, right? So that you can only use language to your brain, you can only use language to your body, to your nerves, to your senses. But at the same time, how you use language, what's the manner in which you speak, what's the manner in which you perform language, that is discursive in quality, right? That carries discursive markers. So what's the kind of metaphor that you're using? What's the kind of sophistication that you're using? Is the language sophisticated? Is the language advanced? Is the language base? And that will obviously very quickly generate identity markers which are socially constructed. Like for instance, if someone is speaking in a very posh language, which is very posh, sophisticated, advanced, full of lovely metaphors, that usage of language becomes a marker of privilege, becomes a marker of prestige. Now, someone uses language in a different way, which is so to say, and not very sophisticated, which is very, very base, full of errors, is ridiculed. So that use of language then becomes a marker of just the opposite: lack of prestige, lack of sophistication. Something which is underprivileged, for instance. It's impoverished. So that informs embodiment in the sense that it informs how your identity is consumed in a discursive space. So identity making or identity formation is a neural, cognitive, embodied process. It also equally is a discursive process. Now this particular space where a woman coming or talking and Michelangelo is a very, very sophisticated, posh, privileged kind of space where people come and talk about high art, high culture, certain kind of dresses, certain kind of fashions, is haute couture. So it's all that kind of a space which is being represented over here. Now the male speaker in this particular poem, it desires to have access to that space, and that desire is important because that desire is constantly frustrated, right? And as a result of which we see this constant procrastination on the part of the male speaker, that he wants to go to the space, he wants to be the epicenter of attention, he wants to be the very much a part of that kind of conversation, a component of that conversation, but he can't, because he can't bring himself along to perform the right kind of embodiment in order to have access to it, right? So that becomes very much an embodiment problem. So among other things, Eliot's early poetry, especially the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, is about the crisis of embodiment, okay? And that's something which I want to emphasize very heavily at this point. Okay, now let's take a look at the second stanza and see how we have this feline image where the evening is like a cat. The fog of the evening is like a cat which is licking its way across different spaces. And it's important for us to see how, again, it's an example of metaphysical conceit where we have very, very disparate entities brought together almost forcibly to generate a certain kind of image, a certain kind of effect, so to say. So we saw already how the street is compared to a very nagging argument which stalks you, nags you, irritates you, doesn't let you go. The street follows you in the same sense of being a stalker. And we have a similar kind of metaphysical conceit coming up over here, where the yellow fog is being compared to something like a feline creature, something which is licking its tongue across different spaces. Let's see how Eliot, or the speaker, represents it. The yellow fog, that rubs his back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke, that rubs his muzzle on the window panes, licked his tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon his back to soothe the fallsome chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. So again, look at the way in which the evening, the fog, is supposed to have a tongue. It's supposed to, walk around the terrace, slipping in and out of the terrace, making a leap, curling once above the house, and then falling asleep. So again, it is a very, very organic metaphor. It's almost to say that fog has a life over here. It has a very animated image. It has an organic image. So, the yellow fog is rubbing its back upon the window panes, like a cat would, right? The yellow smoke is rubbing its muzzle on the window panes. So again, the window panes becomes an important metaphor over here. And a window obviously represents the house. But again, look at the way in which the houses are metonymically represented, which is to say that it's represented to certain fragments. And that, again, is very important in part of the politics of representation in Eliot's early poetry, the very, very interestingly metonymic quality, that nothing is shown to you in a full-fledged form. Everything is broken down into fragments. The body is broken down into hands, feet, fingers. The houses are broken down into window panes, half-open doors, etc. So nothing is holistically presented to you except in fragments. So that fragmented quality is very important for us to observe. And it licks its tongue into the corners of the evening. Again, the fog, the smoke, which are, so to say, they're not really organic entities at all. They're not really living beings at all, but they're supposedly represented as living beings. Lingered upon the pools that stand in drains. So again, look at the very cinematic image. It's almost like a close-up of a pool that is standing in a drain. So, there's very sordid, seedy, urban setting is described to us in very, very cinematic terms. It's almost like someone's moving with a movie camera, and someone's giving you close-ups with a movie camera, and all these close-ups are forming a montage, which forms part of the Eliot's, forms part of the narrative over here. So it has this visual, the grammar of a visual montage or the photo montage. And this is important because Eliot was heavily interested, like other modernists, in cinema, and a large part of modernism's anxiety as well as aspiration was around cinema. And there's a different kind of research altogether to be had. I'm not going to digress too much, but suffice it to say that people like Eliot, Joyce, Woolf, they had this very ambivalent attitude towards cinema. in a sense that they felt cinema to be some kind of threat. They were threatened to a certain extent by cinema because cinema, to them, had a certain kind of visual machinery, had a visual mechanism which would surpass language, they thought at that point in time. And they thought cinema was very potent as a form of representation. But at the same time, there's also an admiration towards cinema, and with the admiration came a degree of appropriation. So you find over here, Eliot is using heavily the grammar of the photo montage, in a sense that we have a sense that someone's moving with a movie camera in hand and is capturing everything around him and giving images, little montage elements, very metonymic images of an evening spreading across a very, very sordid and seedy urban setting, right? And that is depicted to you using the images of chimneys, drains, window panes, yellow fog, yellow smoke, broken terraces, and obviously before that we have the image of the one-night cheap hotels. So the visual politics, the visual setting which is generated out of this particular description is one of despair, one of brokenness, one of alienation, which is a very, very metropolitan phenomena, especially depicted in modernism, right? So this becomes very much a part of modernity, right? And there's a lot of work done comparing the metropolis and the human psyche. One magnificent work is George Simel's book called The Metropolis and Mental Life, which is something I heavily recommend if you want to go deeper into that kind of research. That's one book I recommend very, very heavily. George Simel's, the modernity, metropolis, and the modern life and mental life, right? So that's something which you can read up, and that's something which informs directly this kind of depiction that we see in Eliot's early poetry. So just to come back to this particular stanza, the yellow fog, the yellow smoke are described as feline creatures, organic creatures who are lurking around the house, licking with the tongue the window panes, curling around the window panes, and then rubbing the back in the window panes, and then once seeing there the soft October night, falling asleep by the window panes on the terrace. Okay, so the movements are very organic, the movements are very, very jerky. So again, this has a very, very camera-like quality to it, the very jerky handheld movement. And I'm thinking of Vertov's film Man with the Movie Camera, which is which is very, very famous at that point in time. And maybe Eliot was aware of it, and Eliot was definitely aware of the Lumiere. Eliot was definitely aware of the different kind of cinematic movements happening at that point in time. Eliot was definitely aware of Charlie Chaplin. Again, one good book to read if you're interested in the relationship between cinema and modernism is David Trotter's book called Modernism and Cinema, and that's something we should read if you're interested in that kind of research. But suffice it to say, Eliot's early poetry, especially Prufrock, is full of cinematic movements, it's full of camera movements, and the visual narrative generated in this particular poem is very, very cinematic and camera-like in quality. Okay, so let's come to the next stanza. And indeed there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create, and time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. Time for you and time for me, and time yet for 100 indecisions, and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. In the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. So I'll stop at this point, but I'll just go back and reread this and see how this becomes a very good example of existential crisis, which is informed by a cognitive crisis, informed by something very, very artificial. So the whole image of time coming back, there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. So that is to say, the entire performative quality of embodiment. So you have to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet, right? So, in other words, human meetings or human encounters are very performative in quality. And again, that becomes part of the artificial mechanism of modernity. The fact that every movement, every meeting, every encounter is artificial and performative in quality, and that obviously makes the human subject neurotic, right? This constant compulsion to perform, this constant compulsion to carry out encounters, carry out meetings which are performative, which are perfect, that generates a degree of neurosis, which is something which the speaker is talking about over here. There will be time to murder and create. So again, look at the way in which murder and create, two contrasting adjectives, two contrasting verbs, are put together, juxtaposed together to create this attitude of ambivalence, right? So you can murder something, you can kill something, you can decimate something, and also create something. So murdering and creating go hand in hand in this kind of existence. and time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. So again, look at the way in which something as abstract as question is materialized over here. It has a very solid material signifier, something which can be dropped on your plate, right? Something which is palpable, something which can be held, something which is tactile in quality. And again, this is something that I want to talk a little bit about, especially in the next lecture. The very synesthetic quality in Eliot's early poetry. Now, what is synesthetic? What is synesthesia? Synesthesia is that condition, that cognitive condition, where your normal sense of, normal awareness of things get crisscrossed. Like, for instance, what you can normally smell can also be felt, can also be touched. What you can normally hear can also be smelt. What you can normally see can also be touched. So again, it's basically a crisscross of different cognitive conditions, right? So that very complex cognitive condition, which can sometimes be medical, which can sometimes be spiritual, that is called synesthesia. Now, synesthesia is very much there in Eliot's early poetry. Now, you can see over here, time and question, which are very abstract categories, they're actually seen as something which is tactile in quality, something which you can touch, something which can palpably be presented. So, question can be dropped on a particular plate, on your plate. Time for you and time for me, and time yet for 100 indecisions and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. Now again, look at the way in which Eliot's poetry also has a bathetic quality. Now, what is bathos? Bathos is anticlimax. So it's gearing up for something momentous, for something profound, and then it ends with something which is completely non-profound, something which is almost flippant in quality. And obviously, one of Eliot's very famous line is, it starts with a bang, but ends with a whimper, right? Which is from Hollow Men. So it always ends with a whimper. So you have the spiritual metaphors coming in, condensing together to create something and prepare you as a reader for something spiritual and deep and profound. And then we get this image of taking of a toast and tea, which is the most banal daily activity, right? But the point is, and that's the important thing in Eliot's early poetry, that it actually combines the banal and the profound together, and doesn't look at profound as something that's out there. The profound is something which is embedded in banality, right? So banality and profundity go hand in hand in Eliot's early poetry, right? And the whole image of time over here is important, because that's something which will keep coming back in Eliot's early poetry, especially in Prufrock. Now, there are two kinds of time in Eliot's poetry, and especially in modernism. If we take a look at even in Heart of Darkness, especially we'll see in Mrs. Dalloway and Joyce's Ulysses, there are two kinds of time which are represented in this kind of narratives. One is clock time, standard time, digitized time, something which can be shared and measured and quantified. The other is psychological time, something which you inhabit through your senses, something which you inhabit spiritually, existentially, emotionally. Now, clock time and psychological time may or may not conform together, may or may not be in conformity with each other. It can be completely in sync as well as out of sync, right? Now, what is happening over here when Eliot is saying, when the speaker is saying there will be time, and then of course it comes back to a very banal thing. It's a very, very interesting montage of different narratives of time, and it's a very interesting montage of clock time and psychological time. And a philosopher that is these people heavily borrowed on is someone called Henri Bergson, Bergson, the French philosopher on time. And that's something which Eliot is obviously heavily influenced by over here, right? So when he's saying there will be time to prepare a face, to meet the faces of the meet, which is very spiritual and psychological and existential, and then it all comes back and to the whole idea of taking of a toast and a tea. Now, before that, there's an image of 100 indecisions, which is obviously part of the procrastination package in this particular poem. Everything is getting procrastinated, getting delayed, getting half done. So a sense of being delayed, a sense of being, temporarily complicated is something which we see over here. And of course, it contains 100 visions and revisions. So every vision is followed by a revision. And it all cuts back then into this very banal image of taking toast and tea, right? So the banality and the profundity, they go hand in hand over here in very interesting cognitive ways. And again, we have the recurring motif, the recurrence of the line, in the room the woman come and go, talking of Michelangelo, right? So again, this whole idea of the woman coming and going, leaving, entering and departing, talking of Michelangelo, is obviously, it suggests a very superficial kind of space where people come and talk about certain pointers of privilege. Speaking of Michelangelo will generate a certain kind of identity about you, right? And it's a woman coming and going. Obviously, it's a very privileged set of people, as I mentioned already, talking about something very, very privileged, something very, very high culture. And that particular room in which this particular speaker aspires to go to, but he cannot bring himself to reach there, okay? And the whole poem is about wanting or desiring to go to that particular space, wanting or desiring to be accepted in that particular space, and failing to do so, right? So the entire poem is about a failure of being accepted, the failure to narrate, the failure to talk about what is actually going on in the mind. In that sense, it's very interestingly connected and can be related to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where too we have a speaker coming back from a non-European setting, having experienced something horrifying, having experienced something which is momentous, but it cannot bring him so to actually tell what happened to him, to European audience, right? Because he won't be accepted and received and understood over there at all. So, like Heart of Darkness, this particular poem is also about incomprehensibility. It's also about the failure of communication. It's also about the cognitive crisis, which then becomes a communication crisis, which then becomes an embodiment crisis, right? So that becomes part of the sequence of crisis in Eliot's early poetry, as we can see also in Heart of Darkness. So let's stop at this point today, and I continue with this in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.